Thanks everybody for joining. My name is Blake. I'm the manager of Sandbox at DMZ. It's great today to be with you guys and have the team from the BMZ, the Biomedical Zone at Ryerson, join us for a workshop. So just to give a quick intro, Paul and Catherine, who will be hosting the workshop, they work at the Biomedical Zone. They're going to talk about how you can engage with key healthcare stakeholders while ideating on your problem and your proposed solution. The Biomedical Zone is it's Canada's leading incubator for medical startups, and they work in partnership with Ryerson and St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. So they offer the resources needed to accelerate product development and early stage commercialization. So post the challenge. If you're working in healthcare and you continue to build out what you're working on, they'd be a fantastic resource to keep on helping you accelerate your idea. So with that, I'll kind of pass it over to Catherine, who will kind of take it away and lead today's workshop.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks everyone for joining today. We're very excited to have you all here. So I'll jump right in. Blake already sort of gave a good introduction of what the Biomedical Zone is, and this is us here. We make up the team. So Paul is our operations coordinator, Ferdan is our venture and accounts coordinator, and I'm the research and clinical strategy coordinator. I'll be doing most of the talking today, but Paul and Ferdan are here as well, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So we'll open things up for a little bit of discussion then. So the objectives of the workshop today, I'm going to be talking about how you can begin to define your area of focus, how you can start to identify key healthcare stakeholders that align with that area of focus, how you can think about prioritizing them, and then how you can develop an engagement plan for reaching out to them. And this is going to be fairly high level today. It's really just to give you a starting point for the kinds of questions that you can be asking yourself to begin to narrow your focus and think about who would be the most relevant people to help you define your problem and solution. So I would very much encourage you to have a notepad or a Word document open right now so that you can be kind of taking notes as I go. I think it'll be most useful for you if you are able to think about, how what I'm talking about connects with, the specific solution that you're trying to develop right now. And we are going to be sharing some worksheets after the fact that will help you sort of continue this process, because this really is meant to be an ongoing process for you. You can pick away at it over time. So one other caveat before I start is that whenever you're going through an exercise like this, you always need to think about what the sort of current climate is in the healthcare system. And right now that's very much COVID-19, with no surprise there. But that means that that's going to very much impact the availability of stakeholders right now and the bandwidth that people have for being connected with. So just something to keep in mind, that we all have to be particularly creative and flexible and agile right now when we're thinking about engaging with stakeholders. So you may need to sort of think of some plan B and plan C options for yourself as we go through this.
And sorry, Catherine, sorry, one thing I'll mention too is anybody, if you have questions, and apologies, Catherine, I should have mentioned at the start, I'm looking at the Q&A chat, so feel free to put questions in there and I'll monitor as we go through.
Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned that as well. Yes, bank your questions, and we'll definitely leave time for those at the end, and using the Q&A chat function. So I'll begin by talking about how you can start to think about defining your area of focus, and I've sort of grouped this into 3 key areas. So you can ask yourself which clinical area is most relevant for your product or service. What clinical input do you need, and what clinical output can you generate? And I'm going to, sort of walk you through each of these and give you some suggestions for the kinds of questions that you can ask yourself to begin narrowing this focus. So I'll begin with the first one, really thinking about defining your clinical area of focus. And the main overarching questions here are, what clinical problem are you addressing, and what is your solution? And then from there, you can begin to ask yourself which clinical or administrative area aligns with that problem and proposed solution. So that might be a clinical discipline or a specialty or a hospital department or a particular patient population. It may also be a particular segment within the healthcare system. So you may be focusing on primary care or long-term care. And then you can ask yourself, who are the intended users of your product or service? So that could be patients, physicians, nurses, caregivers. You can think about the direct end users as well as some indirect people that might be impacted by your product or service, or some indirect beneficiaries of your solution. And then you can ask yourself, what is your primary area of focus and what are potentially some secondary areas of focus? So I'm sure all of you are going to be focusing very closely on COVID-19 right now, but it's always good to keep in the back of your mind what other potential areas you could expand your solution into. So I'll give you an example. If I identified a clinical problem as being the fact that there's a lot of misinformation about COVID circulating right now, and people don't know which recommendations are reputable or not, and maybe I want to come up with my solution is an app that collates all the current reputable evidence and some common misnomers. So the clinical area of focus for me then would be public health and health information specifically. And I would think about my end users as being the general public, but some other users that might be relevant are, people who source that kind of public health information, maybe public health officials because they might want to partner with me. And then my primary area of focus would be COVID-related public health information, but my secondary area of focus would be sort of broader health information, maybe around emergency preparedness in the future for other types of health issues or general health promotion. On the other hand, if I was coming up with a clinical problem that was more hospital focused, as some of you may be doing, then you might have a more narrow clinical area of focus. So perhaps you want to develop a patient management system for hospital emergency departments. So your clinical area most relevant is the emergency department. But when you think about your intended users, there's actually quite a number of people that you would want to consider. So your end users would likely be the administrative staff or triage nurses that are, would be directly using your service, but the way that they use your product would then also impact the experience of the patients or other healthcare professionals working in that department, which would then ultimately impact the experience of patients visiting the ED. So you want to think about all of those potential interactions and users to help you understand sort of what the scope of your clinical area is. So I'll just pause briefly. So if you do want to make any notes about this, that might be helpful to think about, sort of what's the clinical problem that you're addressing, what's your solution, and which areas most closely align with that. Who do you intend to be using this? What's your primary area, and what are some potential secondary areas of focus? And then from there, once you've just jotted a few notes down, we can start to think about what your clinical input needs might be. And so the main question here is, what information do you need to better understand your problem, your solution, or your intended users? And really understanding the problem is key. So you want to have a very, very nuanced understanding of the problem, almost as much as a frontline user or frontline staff would understand the problem. And that's really going to allow you to optimize your solution to fit the very specific needs that people are facing. And then the questions sort of below that are, what's the best sources for getting this information? And how might you gather this information? So you'll likely want to speak with as many frontline users as you can to really understand their experience and their perspective of the problem. But there's lots of other sort of secondary sources of information that you can tap into as well. And it's useful to actually, in many cases, start with that so you can sort of get a lay of the land and really understand broadly what the issue is. So you can look to the media or the research literature or government reports. There's a lot of market research data that's available, as well as clinical administrative data through CaiHi. You may also think if there's a predicate device that's available that might be similar enough that you can maybe learn a little bit from them. And so then when you're thinking about gathering information, then you're thinking about doing an environmental scan of information that already exists versus what kind of information do you really need to target through a primary data collection method, like an interview with frontline staff, or maybe you want to set up an observership in a hospital to really watch how people are interacting and working through their day-to-day. And then from there, you can ask yourself, what volume of information do you need to deeply understand this issue? And you really want to get as much of a nuanced understanding as you can. And a term that comes from the qualitative research world is saturation. So essentially, you want to be collecting information until you reach saturation, or you reach the point where, as you're collecting data, you're hearing the same thing over and over and over again, and you're not collecting a lot of, substantially new information. So I think until you get to that point, it's a good idea to continue to seek out information from a variety of sources and perspectives. So if I go back to my public health app example, and I think about the information that I would want to collect, I would definitely want to know, where are people currently getting their health information? And a good source for that might be market research data. It might be the media. I would also want to know, what are the best sources of reputable information? Who should I be drawing from? Who should I be avoiding? I also might want to think about what are the health implications or the health impacts of misinformation. And that might help me to really understand my problem as a health-related problem. And the volume of information I would want to collect would be quite a lot. I would really want to understand, where are people searching for COVID information? Why are they going to those sources? How are they appraising that information? So that I can really develop something that would address this problem. So I'll pause again there. Feel free to make a few notes. Think about what sort of clinical information or input you feel like you need, and what the best sources for that kind of information might be. And then from there, we can start to think about clinical output opportunities. So this is really asking yourself, what information or knowledge do I have the opportunity to generate? So you want to think about which outcomes could you report on that might influence adoption, reimbursement, or regulatory approval. And these are going to be some key metrics that demonstrate the value of your product. So maybe that's a reduction in wait times, or it's higher patient satisfaction, or it's some kind of cost savings. And it's really going to, show somebody why they should choose your product over another. And then secondarily, but very related to that, is what outcomes might you examine through research? And this would be an opportunity to really study and demonstrate the clinical effectiveness or the clinical validity of your product, and provide very concrete evidence to support your claims. And the amount of formal research you're going to have to undertake will be very much related to the claims that you're making. So if you're making sort of large claims and you need to go through regulatory approval, perhaps you're developing a medical device, then there's going to be certain amount of evidence that you'll be required to demonstrate to in order to go to market. Whereas if you're developing an app for the general public, you don't need to produce evidence in the same way, and you may be able to do a much more informal evaluation of user satisfaction, for example. So there's quite a spectrum in terms of the depth of research. There's many different research options and different designs. So you may need to go a full experimental randomized control trial, but you may not need to. You may be able to get away with observational research, or a quasi-experimental design, or a qualitative study. So you'll want to think about what depth of research do you really need to do. And then another piece that's useful to ask yourself is, who would be interested in this information, and what conversations would you be adding to? And that really helps you to hone in on what body of literature your research would fall under. So what gaps might you be able to fill? So thinking back to my public health app example, I wouldn't need to conduct formal research for adoption purposes, but if I wanted to engage in that for sort of more long-term credibility, then I can think about what are the broader conversations that I would be able to add to, and that might be misinformation and the health impacts of misinformation, or it might be conversations about health literacy and people's ability to critically appraise health information. And maybe that would make me think, oh, maybe my app could be used as a health literacy intervention. Maybe that would be worth studying. So by asking myself those kinds of questions, I can hone in on, what's the research area? It would also help me identify who might be relevant researchers to partner with, or what are some relevant grant opportunities that are also falling under that conversation. And then lastly here, you want to think about the best ways of disseminating your research findings. So a really critical part of the research process is knowledge translation and thinking about the different ways that you want to share your findings. And so some of those can be informal through, social media, whereas other research findings may lend themselves to more formal dissemination, like a publication or a conference presentation, for example. But good to think about ahead of time what your strategy for that will be. So I'll again pause here in case you want to make any notes about what kind of research or information or knowledge you think you might have the opportunity to generate and what conversations you might want to be contributing to. So you should have a few notes jotted down for each of these three areas. Um, and these are meant to be sort of dynamic. They all speak to each other. So by thinking through some of your clinical output opportunities and some conversations you'd be adding to, that may have made you realize that, oh, there's actually a sort of other clinical area of focus that would be relevant as well. And then that may have made you think that there's some clinical input needs that some other information you need to gather in order to really understand that area. So all of these will sort of feed into each other, and it can be something that you sort of continue to refine over time. But once you have a few notes jotted down there, then we can think about identifying key stakeholders that would align with each of those three areas. So beginning with your area of focus, the questions you can ask yourself are, based on this clinical area of focus, which organizations or departments would be most interested in your product or service, and who within those departments could you connect with? So if you're developing a product that you think would be used in a hospital, then you'd want to think about which department's most relevant and who within there is going to be most useful to connect with. So if you're developing software to be used in an emergency department, for example, then you'd be most interested in emergency physicians, triage nurses, ED managers, maybe hospital IT managers. Whereas if you're developing a public health information app, as I was mentioning, then the organizations most of interest might be Toronto Public Health or Public Health Ontario, or maybe I would want to link up with a health literacy organization or an advocacy group. And then from there, you can think about, based on your clinical input needs, who could provide you with the most useful information to help refine your solution. So in other words, who are the subject matter experts in this area? So oftentimes it's going to be the managers of a hospital department or board members of a relevant organization, maybe frontline staff, maybe patient groups. It's often tempting to think first of physicians who work in that specialty area, but oftentimes it's actually the managers of the departments that have better insight into the day-to-day and might actually be more available for you to speak with them. So we had a company in the biomedical zone that had developed a patient transfer device for CT imaging. And their immediate thought was that they'd want to connect with radiologists to understand, how their product would be used. But in fact, it was the clinical manager of the diagnostic imaging department that was actually a much more relevant subject matter expert because they were more involved in the workflow of the unit. And they had, sort of more of that nuanced information that was going to be really valuable for them. Another thing to think about is if you're interested in understanding a particular patient population, maybe you want to understand their perspective or their experience, you can sometimes find disease-specific organizations or advocacy groups that are relevant. So, for example, if you're interested in understanding patients with brain injury, then there's the Brain Injury Society of Toronto or the Ontario Brain Institute that might be useful subject matter experts for you. Or if you're interested in stroke patients, then the Toronto West Stroke Network would be, a good organization to have on your radar. So in many cases, these people would be good subject matter experts and might be able to connect you with actual patients as well. And then lastly, when you think about your clinical output opportunities, you want to think about who can help you engage in relevant research and who might help to publicize your findings. So ultimately, you want to identify, clinician researchers or scientists who have a program of research that aligns with what you might want to study. And you'll want to identify people that would be in a position to actually lead some of this research in many cases. So you can look to the literature and see who's publishing in this content area and who's being cited by others. And usually a good sort of way of doing this is seeing who is publishing as either first author or last author. That usually gives a bit of a sign that they're the ones actually leading the research, and they're the ones that are in a position to be responsible for the quality and the ethical conduct of that research. Um, and then you'll want to really hone in on someone that's working very closely, very directly in the area that you want to be working, because researchers tend to have a fairly defined scope of research and very specific questions that they want to be engaging in. So you really want to do some legwork to make sure that there's alignment there before reaching out to them. So I will just pause briefly here in case you want to make any notes. You're going to end up with a spreadsheet that looks like this, and we are going to be providing you with a spreadsheet after the fact so that you can have this in a sort of a more formal layout. But in the meantime, just jot down any stakeholders that you want to sort of keep on your radar as we're going through this. So from there, you're going to have sort of an unorganized list of stakeholders. They'll be sort of grouped by your three key areas, but at this point, then we can think about prioritizing them. So you'll want to prioritize your stakeholders into potential key opinion leaders. And these are people that are going to be likely to champion your product or service. Whereas your key clinical input stakeholders are going to be people likely to be subject matter experts. And then you'll have your key clinical output stakeholders, so people likely to help with your research endeavors and who might be able to take on that principal investigator role. So they're the ones that will be in a position to actually lead some research for you. And then any other stakeholders that you feel are relevant that you want to keep on your radar. So we'll have a matrix like this, and again, we'll share this spreadsheet with you after the fact, but essentially, this is a way for you to begin prioritizing your stakeholders. So you'll have along the left all the names of the stakeholders, and then a number of columns here. And this is not a definitive list of columns. There may be others that you want to add, or some that aren't as relevant, but they're metrics that may help you think about who these stakeholders are and how they might be relevant for you. So you have your stakeholder name. You can input their role and their institution. If they're publishing at all, then maybe the number of publications or the impact of the journals that they're publishing in. If they're speaking at conferences, maybe they're the keynote speakers or they're giving plenary talks. That would be good for you to note down. If they have a history of grants, that's usually a good sign that they're in a position to be publishing and maybe partnering with you to get grants. If they're sitting on any relevant boards or committees, you can note that here. If they have a media presence, so if they're ever being interviewed by the media, that would highlight that they're an influential person in this area. And then if they have any involvement with industry previously, that would be good for you to know for two reasons. One, it might highlight that they would be interested in partnering with you and interested in championing your solution. But it also may highlight that there could be a potential conflict of interest. So if they're involved in industry, but with a company that might be viewed as a competitor, then that's something that you would just want to know ahead of time. Any potential conflicts of interest you can flag here. And then lastly here, we just have a question mark local. So if they're in Toronto, they're going to be much easier for you to reach out with. So just this is an indication of how easy it may be to connect with these people. And then based on that information, you can sort of start organizing what type of stakeholder are they? Are they a potential key opinion leader? So are they, sitting on boards and committees? Are they involved in industry? Do they seem to have a lot of influence? Versus a subject matter expert might not have that same level of influence, but would have that very nuanced on-the-ground knowledge. And then a potential principal investigator would be someone who's publishing a lot, is speaking at conferences, has some grants behind their name. And from there, then you can sort of list your potential key opinion leaders, clinical input, and research stakeholders. So this is just a way of organizing who these people are and what kind of relationship you can hope to have with them. And then from there, you can develop an engagement plan for thinking about how you want to actually connect with each of these stakeholders. So it's really important to have in your mind what the specific need or ask is of each of these stakeholders. So you want to have a plan in place for what you hope to get out of each relationship. And then from there, put it on a timeline so you can prioritize who you want to reach out with first and who you can wait for a later time. So depending on how well you understand your problem area, you might want to start with your clinical input stakeholders, so that you can prioritize gathering that information to really understand the nature of the problem you're trying to solve. You may also want to start with sort of the lowest hanging fruit, or people that are already in your network, people that you can easily reach out to. They'll likely give you some sort of quick information. And speaking to them early will also allow you to start practicing your pitch, so that as you move up your priority list, your messaging and your communication will get increasingly refined. So by the time you're ready to contact someone who might be a potential key opinion leader, you already know the content area really well. You've practiced talking about your solution a number of times, and it's very polished and clear at that point. Another thing to keep in mind is that your pitch is going to be slightly different depending on the stakeholder that you're reaching out to and the nature of your ask. So you always want to think about the audience and tailoring your communication to that audience. And regardless of who you're reaching out to, whether it's a key opinion leader or a researcher, it's always important to have a really clear and balanced pitch. So it can be very tempting to oversell yourself, but it's actually a much better approach to have a very balanced and honest and clear delivery of what it is that you're able to do, and how your solution is going to work. So just some final considerations here. You always want to consider your stakeholder engagement priorities. So who do you critically need to champion your solution? You may have a long list of people that you want to reach out to, but who is most critical to get early on to help you actually push this forward? And similarly, what clinical advice do you need in the immediate term versus longer term? So what do you need right away to really understand the nature of the problem versus what's some information that maybe can wait till later? You'll also want to ask yourself, how important is it for you to conduct formal clinical validation research? And we've already talked about this a little bit, but it's really good to think early on how much evidence you're going to have to produce to validate your product. So if you're planning to go through regulatory approval, then there'll be a certain amount of evidence that you have to produce in order to go to market. And you'll need to plan for that early on, because it is kind of a long process. Whereas if you're not going that route, then you don't need to prioritize formal research in the same way. You'll also want to consider your stakeholder engagement approach, and we've already talked about this a little bit. You need to think about the different ways that you engage with each stakeholder group. So the way that you pitch to a key opinion leader may be very different than how you pitch to a subject matter expert. So when you're pitching to an investor, for example, you always want to highlight your unique business model and opportunities for revenue. Whereas if you're pitching to a researcher, then you would want to highlight your unique contribution to the literature and opportunities for publication. So very different aims there. And then lastly, you want to consider your clinical value proposition. So what unique impact is your solution going to offer the healthcare system, and why would stakeholders be interested in engaging with you? And not just why is your solution worthwhile in general, but what would these people personally get out of being involved with you? So keeping that in mind. And then just some final considerations here. I've already touched upon this, but you'll need to consider the regulatory requirements of your solution. So if you're developing a medical device, then you need to know what the approval requirements and timelines are going to be. Whereas if you're developing software, then you'll want to consider the data privacy and security requirements for that. And I know there was a great workshop last week about data privacy and security, so hopefully you're able to attend that. Just something to keep in your mind. If that's something that you don't know a lot about, then maybe you would want to identify a stakeholder that could help, sort of navigate that for you. And then lastly, we always need to consider the climate that we're in, which is very much COVID-19 right now. So you have to be asking yourself, how feasible are the connections you're hoping to make? How extensive are your asks? And how available are these people? But on the flip side of that, there's a lot of funding for COVID solutions right now. So it's good to think about, how does your proposed solution align with current grant opportunities? And on that note, I'm going to pass things over to Paul, actually, because he has put together a pretty incredible spreadsheet. I think I need to stop sharing my screen so that he can open up his. But he can walk you through a spreadsheet he put together of all the current funding opportunities.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone. I've gathered quite an extensive list of COVID-19 related programs and opportunities. The list is over 50 now. This link will be distributed distributed to you after the webinar today. But it has everything from funding programs to community and collaboration platforms, to the calls from the Government of Canada, the NRC, IRAP, and various other groups. So definitely check this out. It's pretty comprehensive. I tried to include as many of the closing dates as possible as well. So this will be available for you, and please feel free to sort of review, and as you sort of develop your stakeholder mapping and matrix list, incorporate these types of programs and opportunities into that.
Awesome.
Just stopped your sharing my screen. Catherine, back over to you.
Great. Let me see. Get this going again. Okay, so that basically wraps things up. I just have, oops, there we go. Just a summary slide here. Just wanted to recap that we went over a number of things today at a fairly high level. You know, how to define your area of focus, how to identify and prioritize stakeholders, and thinking about coming up with a plan for engaging with them. And I hope that you were able to make some notes as we went. We are going to be, as I mentioned, providing some spreadsheets to you afterwards. And as a reminder, this is just a starting point for an ongoing process. So if you weren't able to, get everything today, that's okay. It's meant to be sort of a dynamic process that you continue to add to and refine. And then just a final reminder that the COVID climate is going to impact the availability of people right now. So I unfortunately don't have any specific advice for how to reach out to people right now. These are very unprecedented circumstances. All I can really say is that we need to, be flexible, and hopefully at least, beginning to think about these kinds of questions allowed you to narrow in on, what area you want to focus on and who are the people that might be relevant. Whether or not they're available right now is going to be something that we just sort of have to take as it comes. But hopefully going through this exercise allowed you to, think about your problem and solution in a slightly different way, and gave you a good starting point for further inquiry in that way. So I will stop there. We can hand things over for questions. And I just want to make a note that I did include our Biomedical Zone email at the bottom there as well. So please feel free to send us an email with any questions or comments you have. We'd love to hear from you. And at this point, we can turn things over to the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate it. Thank you, Paul. That was fantastic. I certainly jotted down a lot of notes and took a lot away. So again, open for questions right now. If you want to send them in on the Q&A, what I'll do is also we'll allow kind of everybody to talk if you have questions you want to say instead of kind of write down. One right now, I see that Moaz has his hand raised in the chat. Moaz, do you have a question? I just saw your hand raised.
Hi. Yes, I did have a question. If it's something that's related to essentially something tied to new micromobility proposals and talk about increasing the number of bicycle spaces available for people in the city of Toronto, I'm not sure if there's an opportunity to create a short-term research project to work with this, but it seems that there is an ongoing social push to increase the amount of available space, and I'm wondering if you've heard about any approaches that could work for this.
Yeah, so research approaches looking at sort of other transit options around the city.
Yeah, essentially because people have been looking at other cities where physical distancing has been supported by additional bike lanes. For example, in Brampton, they've introduced a 5-kilometer bike lane by taking a lane out of the street. Mm-hmm. Is there an opportunity to create, for example, some kind of quick short-term research project that could bolster this? Because it appears like nothing seems to be happening in Toronto.
Yeah, it's actually very timely. Just this morning, I saw that Milan in Italy is deciding to sort of drastically change their public or their bike infrastructure because they're seeing how much pollution is being reduced through COVID, and they want to keep this going. So definitely a relevant topic. I know that Cycle Toronto does a lot of sort of information gathering and observational research on how many people are cycling and what the impact of that is on local businesses, what the impact is on sort of reduction of emissions. So I would definitely look to them. They have quite a bit of sort of research in that sense, and that would give you a good starting point. Starting point for thinking about what's been done already and where there are some gaps, and maybe even connecting with some of the Cycle Toronto folks in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Moaz. We also got a question in the Q&A here. They've heard that with the turnaround time for Health Canada regulatory approvals have been expedited. But for those unfamiliar with the process right now, is there kind of a current expectation of what that regulatory process looks like in terms of steps and timeline?
Sure. So it's a very complicated process. I'll start by saying that, and it's different in Canada versus the U.S. So depending on where you want to be rolling out your solution, you'll have to know to either look to Health Canada or the FDA in the U.S. And it also depends on, there are different classes of medical devices. And then different timelines associated with each of those classes. And the classes are generally organized by the level of risk. So how invasive your device is, or how many, sort of what the impact of this device is. So if it's a fairly non-invasive, then it might be classified as a class 1 device, which would be a quicker and more streamlined process, versus if you're doing something that's going to be extracting bodily fluids, then it'll be a higher risk device, and there'll be more evidence that you need to produce. If you're developing anything that is going to be electronic in any way, then there's a whole other layer of sort of regulations around making sure that it's electrically safe. And so there's many components to it. So it's hard to say, but you can expect the process to be in a number of months. And I don't know about how they're expediting things, so unfortunately I can't answer that specifically about how exactly things are speeding up and where, but I do know that if you're developing something that's very COVID related, there is definitely an appetite to make things run smoothly right now.
Right on. And again, as we go through this, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise their hand, and we can kind of ping you in here. We just got a big thanks for that on the chat, so thank you, Catherine.
Okay.
I think, just out of curiosity, I mean, one thing that was great that you mentioned was, looking at whether it's academic resources, whether it's just connecting on the latest news in healthcare to kind of support, who you're going to talk to and stuff. Does the BMZ have like a list of kind of recommended resources for healthcare news or health tech news that that you guys kind of look at on a day-to-day basis?
That's a good question, Paul. Yeah, jump in.
The simple answer is yes, and we've been putting together specific COVID-related resources as well. That's currently shared with our internal network. We have a newsletter that goes out weekly to our internal team, but we do have an external newsletter as well that goes out on a monthly basis at the beginning of the month. So the one for May is approaching quickly. So if you are interested in staying up to date with all things Biomedical Zone, definitely check out our newsletter. You can find the information on our website, biomedicalzone.ca.
Awesome. And maybe just to continue on that, the newsletter sounds great. You put the Gmail down here. After the challenge, if people are interested in staying connected with the Biomedical Zone or want to come with a startup idea they're working on, what's the best process? Just reach out to the Gmail?
Yeah, you can reach out to the Gmail. Otherwise, we do have an apply function right online. It's a very simple apply online submission form. So that's always the option as well. We review applications on an ongoing basis. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more, definitely reach out to the biomedicalzone@gmail.com. If you think you're ready to apply, then hit the apply button and submit.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Fantastic. So I think, we got one more hand up here, and I think that is Guillermo. Guillermo, do you want to go ahead with your question? Okay. I gotta. Oh, and Guillermo, you're on mute by chance if you're, unless you don't have a question in the hand raise, that's okay too. All right. Yeah. So also, Guillermo, like we'll all be on the Slack as well. We're all in the Hack the Curve channel, just under our names too. So if anybody has any kind of follow-up questions, happy to connect there. And again, the email address. Beyond that, I think I'll open it up one last time to questions. But yeah, Catherine, I'll let you kind of have the final word if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just really a thanks for everyone for joining today. And I know that this may have been a lot of information all at once, but we're very open to being reached out to after the fact. So don't be shy. Email us away, or yeah, Slack us in the Hack the Curve Slack channel.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks to everybody for joining. Thank you for Paul and for Catherine and the DMZ team for putting this together. It's great to kind of work with you guys on this. Yeah, we'll share all the information and go from there.